So this is our second part of our ecology notes. Remember this, it will be divided into three parts. So we just finished the basics of an ecosystem. Now we're going to go into populations, how patterns are arising, how populations are growing, what limits populations, all that stuff. So here are our topics that we're going to cover within this section of notes. Properties of populations. So what exactly is a population? A population consists of all the organisms of a particular species, so it has to be in the same species living in a given area or a certain habitat. So one property of a population I can study is a population size. This is just simply the number of individuals in the population. A second property I can study is population density. This is essentially how crowded a population is. So looking at this picture over here, the more people I have in a given area, the more dense it is. The less people, the more spread out people can be, the less dense it is. And this doesn't have to be for people necessarily, this is any type of population. So plants, animals, and of course humans. So there's an equation we can actually use to calculate population density. It's just the number of organisms that are there divided by the amount of space. So let's look at this example right here. I should see two squares. Each square is a square meter. Okay. So if I was to follow this equation, number of organisms, well, if you were to count all of these individuals, you would get 30 people. And amount of space. So how many square meters do I have? Well, I have two squares. So that's my amount of space. If I simply divide those two numbers, 30 divided by 2 gives me a population density of about 15 people per square meter. Okay? This is an example we can try. So what is the population size? What's my population density of this sample I have here? So each box is a square meter. We need the number of people and we need the number of square meters. So if you were to actually count the dots here, you should get 18. If you were to count the number of squares here, how many square meters are in this sample size? I have about 36. So using that simple equation, 18 divided by 36 would give me about 0.5 organisms per square meter. It's essentially saying like per square meter, it averages out to have about half an organism in each square meter. So that's population density. Let's kind of narrow in and talk about Cincinnati for a sec. So the number of people living in Cincinnati, and this is from 2016. Okay, so it's not current, but it's one of the most current data years I could find. So close to about 300,000 people living in Cincinnati. How big is Cincinnati? It's about 78 square miles. So if I divide those two numbers, that's pretty much giving me a population density of about 3,800 people per square mile. That means per every square mile, there's about this many people that are there. So comparing that number to a couple different cities, New York City, for example, is about 28,000 people per square mile. Los Angeles is about 8,000. Chicago is 11,000. So those are much more dense than Cincinnati is comparing these numbers, right? Closer city to us, Louisville, is only about 1,800. So that's significantly less than Cincinnati. Just a tidbit of information. This year is a census year. I don't know if you guys have heard or seen commercials, ads, or your family talking about filling out a census, but the United States conducts a census every 10 years. This is where your family will be required to send in information about your family, such as sex, race, and ages of the members living in your household. Why do we need that information? We use that information to determine, how many electoral college votes we need, to keep our demographic stats up to date, to know our current populations and densities in our given cities, towns, and states. So it's all fine and dandy counting or using technology to figure out human populations, right? But how do ecologists actually measure populations of animals and plants? The most accurate way would be to count those individuals. That's not really feasible. You can't really go out into the field and count every single individual in that habitat. That'll take way too long. It's not using your time to the best of your ability. So it's kind of give and take there. So what ecologists have done is they've used sampling methods. This is counting individuals within a certain area in the habitat. And they use stats and math to kind of come up with an expected number of the entire population. So hopefully you guys have talked about sampling sizes in math class. You know, if I wanted to conduct a survey for a whole school of how many people eat breakfast, right? Rather than asking all 2,000 kids, do you eat breakfast or not? I could take a sample size of about maybe 50 kids. And let's say of 70% of my sample size did eat breakfast, I can kind of conclude that, okay, about 70% of our school does eat breakfast. So it's using a sample to make an estimate over the whole thing. A couple of sampling methods ecologists use is a quadrant method. So this is shown in this picture down here. It's a square. It can be as small as a square meter. It can be as large as a square mile. But for this is used for stationary things such as plants. Ecologists will count the number of individuals in a certain quadrant and then kind of multiply that by the entire habitat to figure out, okay, how many individuals would be in this entire area. For animals, it's a little hard to do that, right? Because they can move in and out of this quadrant. So this mark and recapture method is used quite often to figure out the population density of animals. So if I was to take a sample and I marked some of them, the next time I took a sample, I would compare my ratios of how many animals are marked compared to how many animals were not marked. And from that, they would use stats and some math to figure out, okay, this is our general size of our population here. So that's counting populations, figuring out how dense is our population. After we kind of figure out, all right, how large is our population, we tended to notice some patterns of how those populations were kind of grouping together. So there's three patterns of dispersion. One is uniform. Like uniform, it's all the same, right? Members are evenly spaced out. This example here, plants that need a very specific space, such as they won't let things grow within that range, those would be uniformly spaced. Penguins are another example because they have defined territories, so they're evenly spaced within their territories. Random dispersion, just as the name suggests, it's completely random. It doesn't depend on anything. An example of this are dandelions. The seeds are dispersed by the wind. It has no control over anything else. It's just completely random. And a third pattern of dispersion I see are clumped. Clumped meaning the animals or organisms are grouped together. Examples are things that live in groups, such as fish or elephants. Also plants that drop their seeds directly near them. So if a plant drops their seeds, it's going to be a clumped population of that type of plant right in that area. So another example, random distribution, uniform, where they're all evenly spaced out, and clumped populations. All right, next topic is what can limit a population's size? So a limitation is something that prevents it from getting larger or prevents it from getting too big, right? So what can limit a size of a population? these are going to be your resources. So a resource is anything that an organism uses to survive. So any single resource that limits a population is called a limiting resource. I can divide these up into two different categories. One is density-dependent factors. Density, we just talked about how populations' density affects or depends on the number of individuals, right? If it is density dependent, that means that that size is dependent on these factors. So what are a couple examples of these? Or competition. The higher the population, so the more dense a population is, competition will limit individuals from getting the resources they need. So imagine there's this population of deer, and so far they have enough resources for all the deer to survive pretty well. And then it starts to get overpopulated. There starts to become this increase of deer. It starts to become more dense. Well, when that happens, it's not really also increasing the resources, right? They still have the same amount of food, space, and water, but we're just increasing the individuals. So when that happens, they start to compete with one another, and that can definitely affect the size of a population. I have predation. So if I have a high population of predators, or I'm sorry, prey, that's going to attract predators. If I have a high number of predators, that's going to lower my amount of prey, right? Because they're going to get eaten. If my prey gets too low, then my predators will also go down. So this relationship of predator-prey, it's dependent on size, right? If I have too much, this will happen. If I have too little, this will happen. So these are density dependent. Another example of something that depends on population size is parasites and disease. These are more likely to break out and spread in high dense populations. Very common example of what we're going through right now is we have this virus that is going around. This is spread by people getting into close proximity to each other, right? So if my population is really dense, it's going to spread more easily, and that's what we're doing. We're self-distancing. We're trying to make it less dense out there so it doesn't spread. We're going to talk about COVID-19 on our next part when we talk about humans, so that'll be more relevant there. But that's a great example of how this is dependent on size. All right, this picture is just a visual to kind of see my relationship between predator and prey. So I have this rabbit and I have what looks like a wolf. So if I have a lot of rabbits here, that's going to increase my wolves, right? Because if they have more food, more wolves are going to come. As I increase my wolves, look what happens to my rabbits. My rabbits go down. Why? Because they're getting eaten. So my rabbits go down, look what also goes down. My wolves, they have less food. And if my wolves go down, guess what? My rabbits are going to go back up and the cycle is going to continue. So these are very dependent on the size and the density of the population. So opposite of that are density independent factors. These affect the population, but it doesn't depend on the size. So these are things like natural disasters, unusual weather, seasonal cycles, human impact, which we'll get to later on when we focus on human ecology. But all of these things affect a population size, but it doesn't really have to deal with the density, right? A natural disaster can wipe out a population, but that can happen to a very small, dense population or a very large, dense one. All right, my timer's almost out, so we'll stop it here and we'll finish the last couple topics in the next